There was a fair amount of graft and corruption involved in this important business. It bothered Gorgas, but not enough to let it hold Huss back. Even after an investigation, Huss continued to be the Confederates' man in London. Secretary Seddon wanted to recall Huss, but either respect for or fear of Gorgas had so far restrained him. Right from the start, the ordnance had their own ships. In July of 1863, they took command of the Collie Line. Gorgas put his brother-in-law, Tom Bain, in charge of running the Bureau's merchant marine, and it ran like all other divisions of ordnance, efficiently and effectively. Now in this shipping venture, Gorgas had to share cargo space with the quartermaster and other Army organizations and the Navy. But it is clear that ordnance got what it needed because they ran the operation. If it were not for the U.S. Navy taking ships and the shortage of money, this important program would have gone a long way to solve the Confederates' logistical issues. Delay was the biggest issue facing the import operation. It took time to get the funds to Europe, to collect up the cargo, to ship same to the transshipment warehouses, to transfer the goods to swift blockade runners, and get the material safely into port. Even in the happy times of 1861, the first arms shipment aboard the Fingal took precious time. The order for arms was placed in the spring, but Fingal did not make port until September 28, 1861. Even when a cargo successfully reached port, their troubles were not over. As we will discuss next, the railroads in the South were, to put it bluntly, a mess. Even if this were not wartime and the country had desired to focus on importation, physical distribution out of the ports would have been a problem. With a large and effective Navy, the Union could make landings along the coast difficult and harass fixed installations at will. The record is full of Confederate units being pulled from the Army to serve as coastal defense forces. Part of the governor's argument for withholding supplies was that they were needed for defense. It took a bit of time for the North to get its act together, but once it learned how to operate a blockade, it became increasingly effective. The first three novels of Robert Macomber's Honor series explains in detail how this was accomplished. One by one, the ordnance fleet was destroyed. After 1862, only 3 ports remained open: Mobile, Charleston, and Wilmington. This last port stayed open until January of 1865, but by then, logistics in the South was pretty much over. A key element of logistics is distribution. It does you no good to have all the production and importation you need if you can't get the goods from where they are to where they are needed. In this time period, 3 modes of transportation were used: railroads, waterways, and roadways. The rail system in the South could never measure up to the quality and quantity in the Union. The Confederacy had very few railroads, and once the war started, what trackage they did have fell into decay. This map shows that there were tracks of varying gauges, which meant that cargo from Montgomery to Raleigh had to be repacked 4 times. To make matters worse, the men who maintained the rail lines were sent to the front, leaving only a skeleton crew behind. The system began to show evidence of disrepair as the first battles were taking place in Virginia. The railroads were maintained by hand, little machinery, few supplies like lubricating oils, and all of the rails spiked by hand, so the shortage of labor doomed this mode of transportation. By an accident of geography, the waterways were badly placed for the Confederacy. Even if they held the Mississippi, which they did not, it ran north and south, when the need for river transportation was southwest to northeast. Further, when the rivers did flow in the right direction, like the Tennessee, they were too shallow where they were needed the most. Finally, river craft were easy targets for the inland river navy of the Union. With 3,500 miles of coastline, the ocean should have provided excellent water transportation. However, what vessels were available were devoted to blockade running and foreign trade. Thus, the waterways provided little aid to the cause. The roadways, both north and south, with a few exceptions, were not much more than bridle paths. The trouble Robert E. Lee complained about illustrates the problem with the roads. Quote, "Our greatest difficulty is the roads. It has been raining in these mountains for 6 weeks. It is impossible to get along. It is that which has paralyzed our efforts." End quote. Once the war passed through an area, all bridges were destroyed, and, like the issues with the railroads, there was not the labor or materials on hand to do an adequate job of repair and maintenance. At this point, I should remind you once again that we keep visiting and revisiting the same topics. This is because this is an overview. Any one of these items could serve the full-length book treatment. Even more than in the North, property ownership and control was a big philosophical issue in the South. Not only state control, as we have seen, but private factory ownership as well causes headaches. In the agrarian South, the population in general, and the Confederate leadership in particular, were suspicious of the capitalist plant owners. As inflation started to eat at the economy, it was easy to blame the mill owners as disloyal war profiteers. In an early attempt at centralization, Myers established the Clothing Bureau in May of 1861. Not only did this organization serve as a distribution site, but it manufactured clothing as well. Too often, however, this government agency was in competition with the private factories in states like North Carolina. When the government needed cotton to finance the Crenshaw steamship line, they had trouble securing large amounts of cotton to send to Europe. One often wondered if these operations were on the same side. Let me give you one other example. When the Federals gained control of northern Alabama in 1862, they took over the cotton and wool manufacturing sites. After the Yankees left the area to chase Bragg, the Confederate Army regained control of these plants. So what did CSA Quartermaster Major George W. Jones do with the newly repatriated plants? He impressed them. Imagine the astonishment of the officers of the Clothing Bureau when Jones presented them with 30,000 drawers and shirts made from his booty. The shortage of labor plagued the South throughout the war. The Conscription Act provided the Army, but disrupted the production of vitally needed war supplies. Factories could gain exemptions if they agreed to government control. However, the uneven management of manufacturing proved to be too much for the Confederacy. Even today, the planned economy is impossible for governments to manage. Before conscription, the rush of volunteers to the Army left many plants with critical skill shortages. For example, after Fort Sumter, the Cedar Falls textile mill stood quiet so that workers could send off to the front the Randolph Hornets in style. The next day, the plant suffered production losses as skilled workers had left to join the fight. The first Conscription Act exacerbated the problem. The Exemption Act of October 1862 tried to place limits on drafting men with critical skills. It failed to stem the bleeding, as military commanders and recruiters just ignored the act. The various secretaries of war did nothing to discourage this behavior. As the war dragged on, even the non-skilled positions felt the drain from the armed forces. Not even the employment of black slaves solved the problem of factory labor and made the problem of agriculture labor worse. Here is a good example of the problem. Superintendent of Railroads, William Wadley, reported that he could do nothing to improve the failing transportation network since so many of his mechanics had been conscripted into the Army. General Lee fought to retain Wadley's mechanics, which coincidentally impacted Lee's own supply support.